Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm your host, John Molesky. I'm joined today by one of our regulars, one of my favorite guests, Robert Daly, director of the Wilson Center's Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. And in addition to a busy week signing a trade deal with China, we want to debrief the Taiwan elections with you as well. So maybe we can start there. A piece in the Washington Post, Robert, said, the end of Xi Jinping's Taiwan dream. That was their analysis. Is that an accurate header for what happened in the election?
No, not at all. It's Xi Jinping's Taiwan dream, or let's be a little bit clearer.
The dream is alive.
The Chinese Communist Party's ambitions and intentions vis-a-vis Taiwan have not changed a bit. It is true that with this election, in which Tsai Ing-wen, the incumbent president, got over 8 million votes and got more support than any Taiwanese leader or candidate has since it launched a democracy.
Let me just say the numbers. That describe 57% of the vote in a three-way race, a turnout of 74%, the biggest election victory since Taiwan held its first free and fair election in 1996.
Right, and the reason this happened is because of what is going on in Hong Kong, because of the demonstrations there. A year ago, after the 2018 fall elections in Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen's political career was all but dead, failed dismally, and there was some question as to whether the incumbent president of Taiwan would actually be the candidate next time around. Mm-hmm. So this reversal in fortunes is because of what happened in Hong Kong. And
how so directly? Is it a sympathy vote for Hong Kong, a show of support vote?
It's a little more than that.
Or is it concerns about what could happen in Taiwan based on what's happening in Hong Kong?
So Taiwan and Hong Kong, the claim that Beijing makes vis-a-vis both of them has been the same. One country, two systems, which was initially a formulation that China came up with relevant to Taiwan to try to convince the Tongbao, the compatriots of Taiwan, that it was okay to return to the embrace of the motherland, that they would be able to keep their own system. That language was then tailored for Hong Kong as well. So Xi Jinping's Taiwan dream, it's the offer of one country, two systems. It has been the banner of that, which says, don't worry, you can be broadly but loosely within our governance. We will have responsibility for your foreign policy, for security affairs, but you can remain autonomous. That claim is dead and discredited in Hong Kong now and in Taiwan. And so for the Taiwan voters looking at Hong Kong, most of them had never really bought into one country, two systems anyway, and to see it fail so dramatically in Hong Kong, which has been part of the PRC now for 22 years. So they've actually experienced the embrace, the governance of mainland China, and they have rejected it. And that's an increasingly, as you know, violent situation. So that meant that the KMT, the Kuomintang Party, and this is the old party of Chiang Kai-shek, the party with which we were allied during World War II, which then had a civil war with Mao Zedong's CCP. Just the quick history, Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT, or Kuomintang, lost and went to Taiwan. And they had been carrying the banner of the Republic of China. And initially the claim was that Taiwan, under the KMT, as the rightful ruler of all of China, would return and take over. That claim is long gone. But the KMT had been the most powerful party until the emergence of the DPP. The KMT, the older party, had continued to support some version of one country, two systems. Even they no longer make that claim.
So what, between one country, two systems and either compliance or invasion, what can emerge as the evolution of this setup that would be acceptable to both sides?
Well, there's no good answer to that right now. Given that the people of Taiwan want a democracy, given that a majority of people on Taiwan, and especially the young, don't even identify as Chinese anymore. They identify as Taiwanese. It's hard to see any accommodation that could work both for the Chinese Communist Party and for the people of Taiwan right now. Mm-hmm. There is a growing body of opinion in Washington. People think that therefore Xi Jinping will invade soon. I don't think that there's evidence of that.
Here's some other analysis from Jamil Anderlini of the Financial Times.
Yep.
There's no doubt Tsai's landslide is a victory for the forces of liberal democracy, but it has probably also made the region just a bit more dangerous.
Well,
what does that mean?
Anderlini has been covering Hong Kong. I mean, he's been covering China very well for a number of years, but he's been on the streets in Hong Kong for a while. So he comes to Taiwan in part from that background. What it means is that Xi Jinping has had his formulation, one country, two systems. It predates Xi, but he's been trumpeting it, rejected. But as I said at the outset, his ambitions have not changed. And if what the mainland Chinese see as an offer of peace and comity is rejected, and their goal of unification doesn't change, will their next move be more militaristic? I think that you will see over the next 4 years China conducting more military exercises around Taiwan, close-in cruises, overflights, circling of the island.
Just for intimidation purposes?
Just for intimidation and to remind them who's boss. You will probably see China pick off more of Taiwan's few remaining diplomatic partners, the countries that recognize Taiwan as the government of China. You will see more intimidation, and you will see a response from Taiwan, which is probably, well, certainly no longer able to defend itself without American help. So, and Taiwan is just about 100 miles off the coast of China. So we were there. We sent a Wilson Center group there in November. We met with President Tsai Ing-wen. We met with her opponent. And one of the things that was striking, there's a line from Shakespeare that kept coming back to me. That's a valiant flea that dares to take its breakfast on the lips of a lion. Taiwan takes its breakfast on the lips of a lion. And yet when you're there, it doesn't feel like a security state. Compared to, say, a place like Israel, which you could also say is a valiant flea in the Shakespearean formulation. That's not a formal statement about the nature of Israel. But there, the security of the state is part of the culture. And it's palpable. Not true in Taiwan, but they are trying to increase their capabilities to make China think twice. But per your question, is there some formula that satisfies both sides? It's really hard to see it right now.
Okay. Well, without the benefit of a smooth transition, I'm going to shift gears to the trade deal.
Okay.
That, as we record this discussion today, was signed yesterday in Washington, D.C. Phase one of this partial deal, some have described it as the low-hanging fruit element, and the big stuff still to come. What's your assessment?
Well, certainly this truce, it's a trade agreement. It's only a partial trade deal at best, is better than increased tariffs and a continuation of existing tariffs. China got the United States to not impose new tariffs that had been promised. It got a partial rollback of some tariffs, although there were still tariffs on over $300 billion in Chinese exports to the United States. So that's the tangible benefit from China, but it's much less than what they wanted. President Trump got a promise that China would spend an additional $200 billion importing goods from America over the next 2 years. And that's over what had been $187 billion in purchases from the U.S. in 2017. That is good news, especially for Americans in the agricultural, pharmaceutical, services, and energy sectors, which will probably be the primary beneficiaries of this. That will not erase the trade deficit, which was President Trump's initial concern. And it isn't clear that China will in fact be able to make all of these purchases, nor is it clear that we'll be able to up production to supply that amount of goods without harming other nations, trading partners, who under free trade, as opposed to managed trade, which is what this is, agreements, are accustomed to American suppliers. So I think it's always good to have a pause. It is no more than that.
So it's essentially what you're describing is it's less about what's in the deal in specific things that will or might happen, and more about what it prevents from happening. That it's sort of a time out, everybody take a deep breath, we won't continue to escalate.
It's time out, but there's no choice about continuing to play the game. And as we've discussed many times here, this isn't just about trade. The trade frictions, what we came to call a trade war, were the most visible, most tangible expression of an American recognition under President Trump, which I think he now has bipartisan support for, recognition that this is a contentious relationship that comprises trade, technology, education, strategic issues, norms and practices, values. So we have a temporary pause, partial pause on one aspect of this rivalrous relationship. while we move full speed ahead in a lot of these other areas, especially in technological decoupling and technological suspicions. So I think if we look at this in terms of the overall relationship, we had trade leading on American recognition that this was a contentious relationship. We now have a pause on the trade side for American domestic political reasons. This, I think, as we discussed last time, is really about President Trump's desire to not have a recession or the threat of a recession going into the election. His desire not to make it clear to American consumers and corporations that, in fact, they are paying for these tariffs, which they are. So there's a pause for political reasons now, at the same time that America is perhaps going down new rabbit holes in the Middle East. So I think looking at the long arc of U.S.-China relations, my question is, having identified China as our greatest long-term strategic threat, are we now, because of the vicissitudes of our politics and because, again, of distractions in the Middle East, going to take our eye off the ball and not prioritize China?
So one of the things I was thinking about, Robert, is as we look ahead at some of those remaining issues that you touched upon, as we think about what phase 2, phase 3, and other agreements might look like, is the beefs or the objections that the United States has with China about trade, and whether that's intellectual property, whatever it might be, do they mirror what the rest of the world thinks of China? I'm trying to get a sense of, is this a unified front in dealing with China, or are we on an island?
So we're certainly not on an island in our concerns about the Chinese economy. These are widely shared by our European partners, by Asian partners. The problem is that as we go after China, rather than uniting with these countries that share our concerns, we're also going after those countries, right, including Canada, with tariffs there and threats of tariffs. So no, we're far from isolated. And not only do other countries share our views, actually a great many economists and even leaders within China also share these views. There has long been an appetite for more reform in China, so that under this agreement, for example, China promises to provide better protections for intellectual property, which China had wanted to do anyway and had begun prior to the trade war. And there are economists in China who are glad to see this as a spur to have that happen. The same is true with China's opening up to financial services, which many Chinese economists have advocated for. And so I think there's some confusion in the American press about what lens to use. We speak about these reforms, these structural issues in China, as if they're going to happen under pressure from the United States. The trade war, I think, is the wrong frame. There probably won't be a phase 2 or a phase 3 of this. The issues are real, but the way to understand them is in terms of China's own appetite for reform and its own decision, should it be forthcoming. It hasn't really grasped this nettle yet, to take on the short-term costs of reform for the long-term benefits, which many Chinese would like to see.
What about that appetite and what it says as far in terms of urgency? You already mentioned that President Trump is looking ahead to an election. He's going through an impeachment. We've got other issues in other parts of the globe. There's so many things that, from the U.S. perspective, would speak to a quick win, right?
Right.
Versus China seems to be able to wait, or can they? What are their concerns, and when will they feel a sense of urgency?
Well, China, it's a very quick win. How much life it has politically for the president beyond this week, or just this coming weekend, is very hard to say. There's also a question about whether we could have had this deal much sooner, and at lower cost, because we've paid over $80 billion in tariffs and about $28 billion to bear out American farmers who were the victims of the trade war. So the costs have been fairly high. So when we look forward at the success of this current truce agreement, we have to first pay back those costs and see where that's going.
So also looking ahead, Janet Yellen recently speaking on this warned that competition between the U.S. and China could slow the development of artificial intelligence, 5G mobile networks, other technology related to national security. What's the timeline on those concerns? How quickly do we have to get our act together to not be stumbling into some other traps that we don't want to be in?
Well, it's a key question, but I think that it is unanswerable. The two looming, and we've spoken before about the inadvisability of martial metaphors and calling everything a war, but the two big forces for decoupling moving forward are in the financial system, because China does not want to be beholden to the American-led SWIFT system for the transfer of payments, which is one of the methods we use to sanction other nations. It would like to build a separate system. There's a chance of a financial decoupling, which is very costly, and also a chance of it's already underway, of a at least partial technological decoupling. One of the reasons we can't answer it is that the United States doesn't really have a consistent policy on this yet. Neither do other countries. And this is in part because these technologies have emerged relatively rapidly and are still poorly understood. So those are, I think, the two fronts to look to over the next year or two to watch how decoupling proceeds.
Any movement on the Huawei issue in this deal?
Huawei is not mentioned in this deal. No, that seems to be treated separately.
Speaking of technology, yes. Well, we'll be back to talk about this more, but
We
thank you for the briefing today
Yes.
on both the issues, and always good to have you here, Robert.
Thank you.
Thank you also for joining us on this edition of Wilson Center Now. Hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us again soon, whether via video or via our podcast. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.